There was a time when hearing the name John D Rockefeller made you shudder. He is not just the world's first billionaire, but also one of the wealthiest people in history. By aggressively enforcing his empire, Standard Oil, he established the world's most powerful monopoly. Crushing competitors, seizing control of several industries, bribing the government, and conducting business as if it were war. Rockefeller amassed a large fortune as a result of his aggressive business techniques and covert deals. Enemies. His career is littered with bitter rivalries, such as those with Andrew Carnegie, and even fierce rivalries. Battles against U.S. presidents. But, before he became the oil industry's titan, Rockefeller was at the bottom of society. This is one of only a few examples of someone rising from the depths of poverty to the pinnacle of wealth and power. Rockefeller's narrative is both uplifting and terrifying at times. It exemplifies what happens when greed and ambition run uncontrolled. So let me transport you to 1839, when a young John D. Rockefeller is born into poverty. John D. Rockefeller was the first child born into a peasant farmer family in 1839. With no extra money. The most mysterious character in his small hamlet of less than 1,000 people, Devil Bill, John's father, was undeniably present. Instead of helping on the family farm, Bill did almost anything else. He was an athlete, for example. A ventriloquist, a hunter, a hypnotist, and even an animal trainer. He once won a tournament and kept a bear as a pet, teaching it tricks. Bill did a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but not much. Bill would also leave town in the middle of the night, leaving John and others behind. To leave his brothers to fend for themselves for weeks or even months, only to reappearance in a sumptuous carriage and shower toys and gifts on John and his siblings. This perplexed John because his family lived in a dilapidated old house, wore torn clothes, and went to bed hungry and cold every night. They led a wretched existence, with brief respites of luxury when his father returned. And the reason for this was that Bill led a double life as a con artist. Bill changed his name from William Rockefeller to Dr. William Livingston and moved from town to town, hawking meaningless herbal treatments and potions whenever he vanished. To the sick and destitute. Because Bill was frequently out executing scams, John's mother solicited John's assistance. Working on the farm, Mom instilled in him a strong religious faith and a feeling of duty while they plowed the fields. Balancing school and farming was difficult for a youngster under the age of 10, but it taught him the value of discipline and hard work. John was overjoyed to be able to assist his family, and he even began brainstorming new methods to gain money. For example, John once tracked down a wild turkey in the woods, stole its eggs, and nurtured them. The young. When they grew into turkeys, John sold some for a nice profit and retained the rest to get more eggs and resume the procedure. Despite his youth, John was now contributing a few bucks each week, having a significant impact on the family's income. The Rockefellers appeared to be on the verge of a respectable and steady life. However, when John was 10 years old, his father, Bill, was accused of sexually assaulting a little girl. Woman. Even though nothing was proven, the Rockefellers faced public disgrace and were compelled to pack their belongings and relocate. You'd think that following this tragedy, Bill would tone down his scheming and infidelity and concentrate on rebuilding his connection with his family. Instead, he did the exact reverse. Bill married another woman while pretending to be Dr. William Livingston. A different state, where no one knew who he was. Of course, he kept this a secret from John's mother and the other women. Bill was usually never around, despite the fact that he had 2 wives. As a result, the Rockefellers migrated from town to town, and John assumed increasing responsibilities as the household's unofficial leader. He kept finding methods to make money, managed the family's finances, and even started making small loans while attending school. The Rockefellers eventually found a good home in Cleveland, Ohio, but now that John was 16 and virtually finished with school, he pondered what the next part of his life would be. John wanted to go to college, but he already had 4 siblings and a 5th on the way. And because John's father was absent more than usual now that he knew his secret, John's mother, his second wife, relied on John to help pay for their food, housing, and schooling. This meant that education was out of the question. John needed to get to work right away. So, 2 months before his graduation, John dropped out of school and began seeking work for a position in Cleveland. He wanted something large, so he compiled a list of all the major railroads, banks, and wholesalers. In the city, there are merchants. However, whenever John turned up for an interview, people laughed in his face. He was only 16 at the time. John was subjected to rejection after rejection, but no amount of humiliation was going to deter him. After 6 grueling weeks, he had an interview at a tiny firm that required bookkeeping help. They decided to give John a chance after seeing his exceptional penmanship and informed him. He was told to get to work right away without being told how much he would be paid. John was overjoyed, and he kept September 26th as a special holiday for the rest of his life. He declared a job day holiday. It was more significant to him than his own birthday. Despite the fact that it was not a large enterprise, John's first job taught him how to deal with people. For the first time, I met with suppliers, paid invoices, and observed the inner workings of a genuine firm. His supervisor came in one day with a $4,000 check and placed it in a safe. John knew the combination to the safe, so when his boss left, he opened it only to hold the note in his hands, mesmerized by how much it meant. John aspired to make as much money as his superiors, so he began repeating to himself every morning before leaving for work, "I am bound to be rich." On the final day of 1855, John's supervisors handed him his pay, $50. Which meant he'd earned it. "I only made a little more than 50 cents per day." It wasn't much, but because he did such an excellent job, his supervisors increased his pay to $300 each year. The equivalent of approximately $11,000 today. The rise provided John with something he desperately desired, independence from his father. With his mother's assistance, he could finally provide his family with the stability they deserved. And, from the start of his career, John personally donated approximately 10% of his salary to various charity causes. However, a recession slowed the business after 2 years of arduous work, and one of the founders lost his job. Leave the company. John took on all of his responsibilities and became the company's lead accountant. However, John was aware that the economic slump had resulted in a substantial fall in the firm's income, and he thought that the firm would soon have to cease operations completely. Nonetheless, John was unconcerned. His 2 years on the job had given him a great deal of confidence, and so John was already plotting his most daring move. John D Rockefeller was eager to launch his own business. John had become friends with Maurice Clark, a 28-year-old chemist who worked down the street from him at his first job. Even though John was just 18 years old at the time, he'd established a strong reputation as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, and one day Maurice informed him that he was planning on launching a business, a production company, and advised that they collaborate. They founded Clark and Rockefeller, after saving some money and going to work. Grain, fish, beans, pork, and other foods are purchased and resold. It was difficult at first. John and Maurice were frequently fatigued from searching for customers on the road, but they took great delight in owning their own firm. And, despite his initial shyness and quietness, John was a capable salesman. Because he was so mature, everyone referred to him as Mr. Rockefeller. The elder guys in the industry trusted him, and the list of clients at Clark & Company was impressive. The name, Rockefeller, grew swiftly. In truth, their main issue was that they lacked the necessary cash to scale the company and handle more clients. However, John and Maurice devised a clever solution to this difficulty. If they wanted to get a $5,000 loan, they'd walk around Cleveland saying their company was trying to invest $10,000, giving the appearance that they had plenty of money, of cash. Because of this easy ruse, banks were more willing to lend them money. And the additional loans they received put them in a good position when the American Civil War broke out. Erupted as business increased even more. As a fervent Baptist who was opposed to slavery, John supported the Union to win the war. However, John was still responsible for feeding his family of 6, and if he stopped working, they would go hungry. They would be out of work. So, rather than serving in the army himself, John bought $300 for a substitute and even paid for the outfitting of dozens of additional Union soldiers. The war boosted the northern states' economies significantly, and Cleveland rose to prominence. A vital strategic point for the Union. Because local food prices were grossly inflated, John's produce company nearly doubled overnight. In 1862, John and Maurice made a profit of $17,000, which is worth more than $500,000 today. Not bad for a 23-year-old, but an opportunity to multiply his fortune came to John's desk soon after. People used to light their homes at night before electricity by burning oil inside a lamp. Normally, this oil was derived from whale fat, but finding and hunting whales was expensive, very tough, and, regrettably, some whales had virtually been hunted to extinction. Someone in Pennsylvania, however, found in 1859 that by employing a tall wooden structure and drilling straight into the ground and using an oil derrick, you might extract industrial amounts of crude oil. This method of extracting crude oil was inexpensive and simple. Profits came rapidly, and because the oil boom had made so many people wealthy, crude oil was in high demand. The nickname, Black Gold, was given to him. And it was at that point that John was introduced to Samuel Andrews, a young guy looking for investors, to construct a crude oil refinery in Cleveland, which was only a day's drive from Pennsylvania's oil fields. Andrews had a big advantage over the rest of the competition. He discovered that applying sulfuric acid to crude oil effectively purified it and converted it to kerosene. Kerosene lasted longer and shone brighter than crude oil when burned. It was a straightforward procedure, but the few who had found it kept it a well-guarded secret. Now that John and Maurice had plenty of money to spare as a result of their successful produce business, they decided it would be prudent to diversify their operations, and so they did. Andrews received a $4,000 loan to start his oil refinery. But, at first, they merely saw this as a side project. John and Maurice continued to manage their produce business while Andrews handled the refinery on his own. It was very simple to set up, and because kerosene was a superior product to crude oil, it quickly sold out. John couldn't ignore the figures any longer. Within a year, the oil refinery had become the most profitable aspect of the company. John and Maurice decided to take a risk by abandoning their former firm and investing entirely in the oil industry. Their initial enthusiasm, however, was confronted with a tremendous challenge. The supply of oil was always unpredictable. Because oil had only been discovered in one tiny part of Pennsylvania at the time, many people assumed that it would soon run out. When someone discovered a big oil field, a whole community of oil miners would suddenly grow around the site, drill every last drop, and then vanish. It had formed as swiftly as it had formed. As a result, there were times when oil was plentiful and prices fell. As little as 10 cents. On the other hand, if it appeared that oil was running out, prices would skyrocket all the way to $14. To say the oil market was volatile would be an understatement. To offset this effect, John chose to avoid mining oil and concentrate only in oil refineries. However, the situation remained exceedingly stressful for John and Maurice. They weren't lucrative since prices were low, and when the wells ran dry, they worried that the last drop had been found and they'd soon have nothing to market. The uncertainty was too much for Maurice, and he agreed to sell his business in 1865. John will receive a portion of the company. This was a watershed moment in his career. John agreed to buy Maurice's portion of the company, despite being terrified to his bones. Corporation for $72,500, about $1.35 million in today's money. Maurice was cashing out, while John was going all in on the supposedly risky oil company. However, it appeared that John's daily affirmation that he was destined to be wealthy was soon becoming a reality, since just as the purchase was being finalized, a massive new oil well was discovered in the area. The Pennsylvania oil fields, removing whatever fears he had about oil running out. Of course, the market was still quite competitive, so if John truly wanted to become as wealthy as he intended, he would have to smash his competition mercilessly. John married a woman who shared his religious passion a year before purchasing his business partner's stake in the company. Despite his newfound wealth, John purchased a modest home in Cleveland, where they proceeded to build a family. So, with his personal life in order and the northern economy prospering following the Union Army's Civil War victory, John was ready to start constructing his empire. With his partner no longer present, John renamed the company Standard Oil. He then went about constructing a second refinery and began selling kerosene to Europe. John was convinced that the oil sector would make him enormously wealthy, but it soon became clear that he needed some assistance. So John hired a new partner, Henry Flagler, to help him run the enterprise. And the two men looked strikingly identical. Henry, like John, was not interested in amassing a small fortune. He desired to develop an empire. That's why, when John told him about Standard Oil's big goals, Henry was all in. He was also as religious, disciplined, and dedicated as John, possibly even more so. The only difference was that Henry was even more ruthless in business. Henry treated business in the same way he did war. The only way to win was to lose. To thoroughly destroy your adversary, and John followed suit. Because rivalry in the oil refining business was rapidly becoming warlike, Rockefeller's product was no longer unique now that others had discovered how simple the refining process was. Other brands of kerosene were cropping up all over the market. So John and Henry began plotting. deciding to build strategic alliances that would not only increase Standard Oil's earnings but also harm their competitors. One example was when John discreetly conspired with railroads to obtain lower transportation costs than all of their competitors. At the time, oil was delivered from one location to another via a vast network of trains dominated by 3 railroad companies: the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania Central. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the most powerful enterprise in America at the time. It was advantageous for New York Central because of the way their routes were planned out, and the Erie Railroad to transport oil to Cleveland refineries. However, it was more profitable for the Pennsylvania Railroad to transport oil directly to New York. York or Philadelphia? As a result, the Pennsylvania Railroad predicted that Cleveland would be wiped out as a refining center, and they drove totally out of town. Following the announcement that the city's biggest railroad was departing, many refineries in Cleveland shut down. I also fled the city. This was a tragedy for the New York Central and Erie railroads, both of which had made significant investments. They were now losing clients in Cleveland. Instead of joining the panicked crowd and fleeing Cleveland, John noticed the Erie Canal. He chose to take advantage of the desperation of the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads. In exchange for a steady supply of oil via their networks, John arranged an agreement with the Erie Railroad in which Standard Oil would receive a 75% discount on the railroad's official rate. Shipping fees. In exchange for a daily order of 60 carloads of refined oil, John struck another agreement. When the official rate was $2.40, the New York Central Railroad agreed to pay $1.65 every barrel shipped. So John now had highly advantageous rates with both railroads. And, while railroads were hesitant to accept the lower pricing, he assured they found consistent shipments to be attractive. Indeed, since these railroads transitioned from delivering a variety of commodities to focus solely on oil, they may streamline their operations and increase their profitability. So it was a win-win situation for everyone, except the Pennsylvania Railroad and Standard Oil's competitors. Because of the agreement, Cleveland became the country's largest refining hub, and because the Pennsylvania Railroad had abandoned the city, it was at a significant disadvantage when it came to transportation. They are attempting to resurrect their business there. And, of course, the railroad rebates that John had negotiated with the railways were kept a secret from Standard Oil's competitors, requiring all other oil companies to pay full price to transport their oil on the same trains. And here's the thing. Because John knew his costs were now lower than those of all his competitors, he was able to start a pricing war. To remain competitive in the market, John would cut the price of his oil, forcing his competitors to do the same. But, because John knew his competitors were paying more to transport the oil than he was, and so had higher costs, even if they charged the same amount for their oil, John was still profitable. More profit. He was well aware that his competitors would perish. So John kept lowering prices, and ultimately the price would go so low that some competitors would abandon him, would declare bankruptcy. Standard Oil would have far less competitors once they went bankrupt, allowing John to up his bid price again, and charge considerably more than he did before. It was tough, but it worked wonders. Now, John was well aware that railroad rebates were morally questionable. They provide much preferential treatment to larger enterprises over smaller ones. However, it would be more than a decade before any antitrust laws were enacted to ban such monopolistic activities. Therefore, legally, John was not breaking any laws. In the meantime, Standard Oil's warlike approach of crushing competitors was paying off, and the company made massive profits. However, there was one major issue. Because of the large oil excess, oil prices had plummeted as low as $2.40 per barrel, and as new oil reserves were discovered in Pennsylvania, it appeared that the price would continue to decline. The surviving competitors were barely hanging on. In fact, John calculated that roughly 90% of them had died. The majority of oil refineries were losing money. However, John began to worry that his personal accomplishment would be overshadowed by a total collapse of the entire oil sector. If they were dealing with a system-wide issue, John was persuaded that they needed to find a solution. It requires a system-wide solution. And John's remedy would be to form an even more powerful monopoly, such as it had never before been seen. By 1872, John and Henry were aggressively growing Standard Oil, but oil prices had plummeted yet again. 25%. They realized that if they didn't act quickly, the entire industry would collapse, and they took action. Would fall in line with it. As a result, John agreed to work with Tom Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, After the arrangement, John struck with the other two major railroads. John and Scott had become rivals, but now Scott was reaching out to create a similar covert pact that was even more ambitious, as well as cunning. Scott envisioned a covert collaboration between the main railroads and a small group of individuals, of the largest refiners, which included, of course, Rockefeller. As a result, Standard Oil, as well as the Pennsylvania, New York Central, and Erie railroads, were founded. An alliance together, under the unassuming moniker South Improvement Company, or SIC for short. In exchange for a hidden 50% transportation cost rebate, John agreed to ship all of his oil only through these railroads. But John wasn't satisfied with simply receiving advantages. He planned the transaction to be catastrophic to his competitors. Standard Oil, for example, would receive a 50% rebate on the cost of their shipments anytime anyone outside of this covert alliance delivered kerosene through these railroads. In addition, these were known as disadvantages, and they meant that Standard Oil's competitors would not only pay higher rates to transport their oil on the same railroads, but they would also face increased competition. Rockefeller would receive a portion of that money. To top it all off, the railroads would surreptitiously provide John with precise information concerning their competition's shipments. He would know every element of his competitors' operations, allowing him to undercut them by selling kerosene at a lower price. Anyone outside of this covert pact had no chance. It was a death sentence. They were kicked out of the club, and the worst part was, they had no idea. However, many of Rockefeller's detractors regard this entire arrangement as a blatant power grab. Grab, according to John, was the best way to save the oil sector because, with so many rivals, their product was growing closer and closer to being given away for free because there was so much oil available. He argued that eliminating these smaller refiners would benefit the oil sector as a whole. But it didn't matter because allegations of a railroad and refiner cartel quickly spread. When consumers read in the headlines that the rates for the country's three most important railroads had doubled overnight, they knew exactly who to blame: Tom Scott of the Union Pacific, Standard Oil's John D Rockefeller, and Pennsylvania Railroad's John D Rockefeller. Thousands of people flocked to the streets in protest as news of the alliance spread. Protesters used violence, vandalism, and arson to threaten Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Protesters hijacked Standard's cargo, spilled their oil, and tore the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks from the ground. The ultimate blow to the SIC came when the oil miners retaliated by boycotting the conference. The SIC John's refineries were useless without a source of crude oil, therefore 2 months after its formation, the company was dissolved. The SIC was no longer in existence. It was an embarrassing experience that garnered a lot of bad attention for John. But it didn't bother John. He simply determined that if he couldn't dominate the oil business through dirty backroom agreements, he would destroy it. Then he'd do it in public and force his way into the industry. John sought to bring as many refineries under Standard Oil as possible, and to his amazement, he was successful. The SIC debacle had actually resulted in one significant development in the industry. Despite the extremely public aftermath of the SIC alliance, there were still whispers of a hidden plan. Many individuals believe that there is still a railroad and refiner cartel in force, and that there must be some type of hidden pact in place between the great railroads and the big refiners. Even though there was none, the rumor quickly spread. Oil refiners were concerned that if Standard Oil continued to have a secret agreement with railroads, they'd get crushed. And John decided to take advantage of this threat. In a 6-week period known as the Cleveland Massacre, John managed to scare 22 people of Cleveland's 26 oil refining corporations into selling out for fractions of what their enterprises were actually worth. Even if the SIC did not go forward, the dread it produced forced many refiners to sell their businesses to John in a panic. Furthermore, because many other refiners were losing money, John would show them his company's finances so they could see how well Standard was doing and to prove to them that he could do it. Outlast all of them. For most refiners, the choice was clear: fight a losing war or pay out. And anytime someone sold out, John gave them only 2 options: sign a devastating contract barring them from ever working in the industry again, or they could leave. Join the Standard Oil team. Because most competitors elected to join Standard, John got access to the industry's top thinkers. He has me working for him. All of the entrepreneurs who had been running their individual businesses were suddenly merged into one enormous organization under the Standard Oil umbrella. Furthermore, when new refineries came under Standard's ownership, they were outfitted with the most advanced oil refining technology, which significantly reduced prices. By mid-1873, John was in command of an empire that included an increasing number of extremely efficient refineries capable of producing over 1 million barrels of kerosene per year. He now controlled the Cleveland refineries. However, on September 18, 1873, a day historians refer to as Black Thursday, a series of bank failures occurred, triggered a 6-year national recession in the United States. For the first time, oil prices fell due to a lack of supply rather than a lack of demand. Because of a total absence of demand, Standard started only 2 of its 6 primary refining plants in Cleveland. A year after Black Thursday, a single oil barrel could be purchased for as little as 48 cents, which is less than the price of an equal amount of water. Therefore, everyone from miners to railroads, and the refiners were dreading what seemed to be their unavoidable fate, bankruptcy. However, due to Standard Oil's meticulous financial management and outstanding credit with banks and their upgraded refineries, John was one of the country's only refiners who could still turn a profit. And, as usual, John saw every problem as an opportunity. He detected the odor of blood in the water. At this point, John had already reigned in Cleveland, which was one of the country's primary refining centers. But he recognized that the grim economic conditions were a national issue, and therefore refiners in other refining cities such as Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York were all struggling badly. As a result, John determined that now was the time to stock up on as many as he could. As a result, John launched a statewide buyout campaign, and if somebody was hesitant to sell out, John would stoop to subterfuge. For example, he would purchase all available refining apparatus and barrels, preventing competitors from ever producing or packaging their oil. And if they did manage to produce any oil, he would reserve every railroad for months, making it impossible to ship it elsewhere. Another of John's ruthless business techniques was to put pressure on railroads to raise prices for other refiners to the point where they would soon go bankrupt. He waited for his competitors to be on the point of bankruptcy, then offered to save their firm by buying them up for pennies on the dollar. Pennies. Everyone Standard Oil wanted to buy was eventually integrated into the rising company. Huge, or crushed by its weight. By the time the economy began to improve, Standard owned more than half of Pittsburgh. They have the most refining capacity in Philadelphia, as well as the largest refineries in New York. To gain even greater influence over the industry, John constructed a network of pipes that carried crude oil into their refineries and pumped refined oil out of large cities. Because of the pipelines, Standard relied less on railroads to carry their oil, lowering their unit costs even further. With its pipelines encircling the eastern seaboard of the United States like tentacles, Standard Oil earned the moniker, the octopus. Despite being just in his 30s, John D Rockefeller was now the unquestioned king of oil refining and one of the country's wealthiest individuals. However, too many people had become victims of Standard Oil's exploitative business methods by this point. The firm was dubbed the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country, by America's leading newspaper at the time. John's enemy list was growing dangerously lengthy. The oil industry was a huge source of business for railroad firms since miners needed to carry oil from wells to refineries, and refineries needed to get it to big cities. However, when Standard Oil began laying a massive network of pipelines across America's landscape, the railroad firms on the Eastern Shore were confronted with the fact that one of their most significant customers was rendering them obsolete. So Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, decided to install his own pipelines, but he also did something he knew John would not approve of. He began building his own oil refineries. Because Scott was directly competing with John viewed this as a declaration of war. He resolved to launch an all-out assault against America's most powerful corporation. To begin, John canceled all of his business with the Pennsylvania Railroad and redirected it elsewhere. Instead, all of that oil was diverted to other railroads. Then, John reduced the price of Standard Oil kerosene, which meant that competitors had to cut their prices. To do the same, lowering their profit margins and limiting shipping orders on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Finally, John persuaded the New York Central and Erie railroads to dramatically reduce their freight prices for everyone, ensuring that the Pennsylvania Railroad lost even more business. And these techniques unquestionably worked. To compete with all of this, the Pennsylvania Railroad had to practically pay refiners. They will transfer oil for them. Scott was also forced to lay off hundreds of employees and lower the pay of those who remained by 20%. However, John's attack had an impact on more than simply the Pennsylvania Railroad. Another major railroad, the B&O, was forced to undertake similar layoffs and wage cuts, and as a result, inadvertently, John's attack on the Pennsylvania Railroad triggered one of the most violent worker strikes in American history. Several people were killed, and the Pennsylvania Railroad lost 500 freight cars, 120 locomotives, and 500 freight cars in Pittsburgh alone. 27 buildings were set on fire by protesters. The pandemonium that was emerging began to worry even John. The Pennsylvania Railroad, once supposed to be unbeatable, had lost the battle against Standard Oil before long, and Tom Scott was more than ready to submit. Scott was in a difficult situation, and John's business partner Henry, who saw business as a form of war, saw this as an opportunity to completely smash him. But John had a better idea and went to work on a major deal with the railroads. John agreed to guarantee 47% of Standard's traffic to help the Pennsylvania Railroad survive. The rest went to the New York Central, the Erie, and the B&O. In exchange for a consistent supply of supplies, John sought a substantial covert rebate on he sought even more precise information about their competitors' shipments, and he demanded 20 cents for every single barrel that passed through. Any of the railroads can also be used. Much of this was identical to the previously planned secret alliance, but this time, John had the balance of power and could virtually demand whatever he wanted. The railroads didn't have much of a choice. As a result of this arrangement, John became one of the most powerful men in America. John now practically controlled the railroads as well as the oil sector. He kept an all-seeing eye on all of his opponents. He utterly dominated Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, with barely a few exceptions. There were a few refineries in New York that weren't his. Standard Oil now controlled about 90% of the oil refining sector. However, as for John's adversary Tom Scott, despite the fact that John had now technically reached a contract with his company, the Pennsylvania Railroad never recovered its footing, and Scott personally suffered as a result. He never got over his devastating setback. Scott had a stroke a year later and died shortly afterwards. What's remarkable here is that Tom Scott was a mentor to a young Andrew Carnegie, who was to the steel business what John was to the oil industry many years before. Carnegie blamed John for the loss of his beloved mentor. As a result, a rivalry developed between Carnegie and Rockefeller. The king of oil goes up against the king of steel. The competition between these two industrial heavyweights would heat up over time, but for now both guys were resolved to outperform the other in terms of wealth. In the midst of all of this, John was becoming a well-known public figure. The battle with the Pennsylvania Railroad, his competition with Carnegie, and his enormous money and influence had all catapulted John from a mystery oilman in Cleveland, Ohio, to now being the richest and most powerful man in the world. One of the most divisive individuals in American newspapers. Despite his wealth, fame, and influence, John did not live a lavish lifestyle that many of his contemporaries did. Instead, when he went to New York, John spent his free time with his children. He avoided the company of wealthy bankers and celebrities, and he rarely purchased expensive clothing or indulgences. John was affluent by his 90% dominance of the oil refining industry, which he quietly managed from his new office in New York. He seemed to be able to sit back and enjoy the results of their labor now. However, the contrary was true. Despite his utter domination, the state of the industry was changing, and quickly. Thomas Edison had created a light bulb that gave off a strong white light for 100 hours a few years before, and he was pushing to light the country with electricity instead of oil. Then, in 1885, a massive crude oil resource was discovered in northern Ohio. Because of these two events, many Standard Oil executives began to panic, fearing a major oil oversupply. This would return the industry to the days when oil was priced at 10 cents a barrel. But, while the rest of his team was panicking, John remained cool as ever. He was an expert at converting chaotic situations into opportunities at this point, and this was the crisis he had been anticipating. Standard Oil had previously primarily focused on oil refining. John had been pursuing horizontal integration by acquiring other refining companies that did so. He did the same thing. But John anticipated that the discovery of oil in Ohio would transform the oil sector, and he acted accordingly. Wished to ensure that his company benefited from Ohio's new oil reserves. So this was just the pretext he needed to launch bold plans for vertical integration. Standard Oil would now be present at all stages of the supply chain. John essentially desired to eliminate all intermediaries and get complete control of the oil sector. Everything from oil wells to refineries to transportation, storage, and distribution. As a result, John doubled down on every aspect of the firm, transforming Standard into its own entity. Supplier, transporter, producer, and retailer are all examples of roles. Standard Oil's previous operation had a solid foundation of industrial infrastructure. While John worked out how to profit from Ohio's new oil fields, they wanted to make sure it remained earning money. He began by purchasing land in the area, erecting hundreds of derricks to dig for oil, and constructing new pipelines to carry it. However, it immediately became evident that Ohio's oil had one major flaw. Even after it was refined, it had such a foul odor that it was dubbed skunk oil. As a result, no one wanted to buy it, and it sold for as little as 15 cents a barrel. Almost everyone else gave up trying to sell the skunk oil right away, but John persisted. Engaged a team of chemists to investigate the skunk oil, and within a year, they had discovered a way to eliminate the sulfur in the oil that was producing the foul odor. Standard was now the sole company supplying this new, cheaper sort of oil, giving John a huge advantage when, a few years later, massive amounts of oil began to flow in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and California. It was now clear that America was sitting on an ocean of petroleum, and Standard Oil was the firm best positioned to fully capitalize on it. Around the same time, automobiles were beginning to supplant the horse and carriage, and fortunately for John, the process of refining crude oil produces one significant waste product, gasoline. Standard saw an opportunity to turn a material they normally discarded into a quick source of extra earnings as wealthy consumers were exposed to the automobile. This meant that even when the United States was thrown into an economic downturn in 1893, and 600 banks were forced to close their doors, John was prospering once more. Despite the harshest economic conditions, with John's riches increasing larger than ever, he took a back seat in day-to-day life. Day-to-day operations of Standard Oil, and began to consider investing elsewhere. You'd think that a man as capable in business as John would also be a good investor, yet if you looked at John's own investments at the time, you'd find that the majority of them were in the red. John understood that if he wanted to maintain the generational riches he had accumulated up to that point, he needed to get his finances in order, so he recruited Frederick, a Baptist minister, Gates to assist him. It's impossible to tell what John was thinking when he engaged a former priest to manage his estate, but years later, when asked who the greatest businessman was, he replied, John. He pointed to Frederick as the most successful man he'd ever known, and there's little doubt Frederick helped John's fortune grow much larger through a series of shrewd investments. Around the same time, John's son, John Jr., graduated from university. And John reasoned that having Jr. learn from Frederick would be a wonderful idea. Frederick taught Jr. how to invest and negotiate, and the two of them quickly transformed John's ludicrous portfolio into a riches multiplication machine. At this point, John advised them to begin making large investments in other industries, such as purchasing railroad businesses, which would come in handy later. The most important of these investments, however, was a lengthy stretch of property in Minnesota known as the Mesabi Mountain Range. A 120-mile-long vein of the highest quality iron ore ever discovered was discovered in this territory. Maybe North America's largest. Iron is now the primary element required to create another significant material, steel. So when Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, received this news, he feared that John was intending to compete with him in the steel business, which John had been planning for some time. For a long time. Until recently, the rivalry between Rockefeller and Carnegie had only been about who was wealthier, but they were now engaged in an open war in Carnegie's area. John was no longer satisfied with dominating the oil industry, he was now after the steel industry. John instructed Frederick and Jr. to begin mining operations in the Mesabi Range, and they outbid Carnegie by selling their high-quality ore to his competitors at rock-bottom prices. As they expanded their mining operation, rumors began to circulate that John intended to further invade Carnegie's specialty by constructing a massive steel plant. Now, on Carnegie's side, he had a few decades head start in the steel sector, which gave him enormous influence over John, but he also had two major problems. For starters, John possessed a more plentiful and higher quality iron source than Carnegie. Second, Carnegie made the mistake of presuming that iron would always be inexpensive. He hadn't made any investments in iron mines in the last few years because they were cheap and easy to find. His naive confidence had shown to be incorrect over time, and his supply of the most vital the mineral he required was becoming low. So, in order to salvage his company, Carnegie approached John, Frederick, and Jr. Make an agreement. By the end of the negotiations, the two parties had reached an agreement. Carnegie pledged to acquire a minimum of 600,000 tons of ore per year from John's mine and solely transport all of it plus an additional 600,000 tons from his own mine via John's railroads, of which he now owned a couple. Carnegie would receive a covert rebate from John in exchange for supplying his train with coal. There is so much business. It was the same type of mutually advantageous covert deal that John was accustomed to forming. The train firms for his oil shipments. Except now he was the one secretly providing Carnegie a rebate. To seal the bargain, Carnegie pledged not to purchase land near the Mesabi Range, and John agreed not to establish a steel plant. The relationship appeared to be a win-win for both men, and it appeared that they were willing to overlook their differences if it meant they would both profit greatly. And, of course, this will harm both of their competitors. The deal between these two erstwhile enemies quickly made headlines, sparking a craze. Wall Street is a financial district. Investors intended to make a fortune by investing in John's iron mines and Carnegie's steel mills, which both appeared unstoppable now that they were cooperating rather than competing. However, one man was a little more creative than merely investing individually in their two businesses. And that man's name was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan realized that by combining John's investment and Carnegie's firm under a single name, he might create a steel monopoly more profitable than Carnegie's. Steel, and much more powerful than Standard Oil. J.P. Morgan referred to it as the U.S. Steel, and if everything went well, it could be the most valuable business in history. So J.P. Morgan approached John and inquired how much he would be willing to pay for the Mesabi iron mines. 4. But, to his astonishment, John suggested that Morgan speak with his 27-year-old son, John Jr. J.P. Morgan assumed he was dealing with a rookie. After all, how much could this 27-year-old actually know? But when J.P. Morgan approached Jr. and asked him directly, "What's your price?" The richest banker on Wall Street didn't faze Jr. He calmly replied, "Mr. Morgan, I believe you made a mistake. I didn't come here to sell anything." Jr. insisted that J.P. Morgan decide the price for the Mesabi area, which he understood you wanted to buy. Jr. had complete control of the negotiation. Morgan was so taken aback that he had to leave his office and reconsider his tactics. J.P. Morgan eventually made his offer. In exchange for total control of the Mesabi mines and the existing mining business, he paid $88.5 million. In U.S. today's steel stock is worth slightly more than $3.1 billion. Morgan later purchased Carnegie's entire steel industry and merged it with the U.S. Steel was the world's first billion-dollar corporation. But keep in mind that John now held a sizable portion of that corporation, as well as his U.S. Steel inventory's value quickly grew to more than $200 million. Furthermore, due to the automotive boom and the increased demand for gasoline, Standard Oil was expanding, becoming an even more formidable monopoly than it had previously been. Not to mention that, due to Frederick, John's investments were back on track. With all of this, John's fortune grew to unfathomable proportions. It had now extended across several industries, and John was finally ready to take a step back. The commercial world entirely. However, John never publicly announced his retirement, which proved to be a critical error. The general population still connected him with Standard Oil. And that would soon come back to haunt him, as John was about to be involved in the most heinous crime imaginable. He was embroiled in the most public scandal of his career. Even though he was now retired, John still controlled roughly 30% of Standard Oil's stock, and because of the auto industry's phenomenal growth, he was actually becoming wealthier. He is happier now than he was when he was working. Standard, on the other hand, had such a poor reputation as a result of their severe business practices. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt saw it as the ideal target to battle against throughout his climb to power. Now, this wasn't his first attempt. Previously, Roosevelt had approved legislation that penalized railroad refunds, but it was insufficient. To pique the public's interest, as his first presidential term was coming to a conclusion. So Roosevelt noticed that popular opinion about John and Standard Oil was rapidly changing. Ida Tarbell, a journalist, was largely responsible for transforming my disdain into a fierce loathing. Tarbell's father, you see, was once one of the oil refiners bankrupted by John's harsh business techniques. Her father's business partner committed suicide after John squandered their riches. Tarbell was now releasing monthly pieces that offered a detailed story about the company and the man who had bankrupted her father and ruined her childhood. She didn't have many kind things to say, as you might anticipate. Tarbell succeeded in breaching John's wall of secrecy. revealing the terrible history of the once mysterious Standard Oil, with John as its protagonist. Everything was revealed, including his backdoor dealings with railroads, intimidation techniques, and the politicians they had paid. The American public devoured the story. The documentary also revealed John's father's history of scams, sexual assault allegations, and the discovery of his second marriage, which had a tremendous emotional toll. John and his family. Needless to say, John never responded to anything Tarbell wrote, and his public image suffered as a result. She defiled him by publicly condemning him. And his silence simply enraged the public even more, so John went from one of the most discreet and mysterious members of the American elite to the national embodiment of corruption and greed. The public was now desperate to see John and Standard Oil punished for their misdeeds. As President Roosevelt neared the end of his first term, he observed an opportunity to exploit public discontent by making Standard Oil his adversary. During his presidential run, Roosevelt promised to abolish monopolies. As a result, when he was re-elected, it was time to make good on that promise and fight war. Rockefeller's empire is under attack. He started a full-fledged probe into Standard Oil, and the anti-monopoly statutes are now in effect. That unscrupulous politicians had always neglected became fully utilized. Roosevelt declared that the government would pursue Standard with all of its resources. The U.S. government in an unprecedented all-out assault. Standard was accused of monopolizing the oil sector, charging predatory prices, and negotiating unfair terms. Railroad rebates, business espionage, and hidden ownership of competitors are all examples of unethical behavior. In addition to fighting 21 cases in individual states, the federal government Standard was slammed with the largest lawsuit in history at the time. There were over 1,000 exhibits and 444 witnesses. Standard Oil was a monopoly, according to witnesses, and over 12,000 pages of incriminating evidence. The litigation was so large that it lasted years after Roosevelt left office, but his desire to fight Standard Oil was eventually realized. When Standard's profits were reviewed, it became clear that it was a full-fledged monopoly. Because they controlled 87% of American oil refining, 100% in some instances, Standard was abusing their monopoly by overpricing their kerosene in order to make huge profits. In addition to being confirmed as a monopoly, evidence revealed that Standard had routinely bribed hundreds of legislators and had intentionally violated various antitrust laws. On May 15, 1911, after being found guilty of the charges charged against them, the federal government ordered Standard Oil to be dissolved and its subsidiaries reorganized into independent, unconnected companies. After 41 years, John's empire had been given a death blow, and it was being divided up. Of course, you'd think that splitting up an enterprise the size of Standard Oil would be a losing proposition for John. Many of his enemies, including Ida Tarbell and President Roosevelt, thought this was a cause for celebration. What they didn't expect was for Standard Oil's demise to be the most profitable event in John's career. You see, while the dissolution may have appeared to have devastated Standard, it was actually a very convenient time for the firm to be broken up. Rise, as the industry as a whole was undergoing significant changes. As new oil reserves were discovered in regions like Texas and California, independent refiners grew in popularity. Were establishing a foothold in new markets quicker than Standard could absorb them. The Middle East and Russia appeared to be their first serious international competitors. Moreover, a year before the ruling, gasoline sales had eclipsed kerosene sales, and the industry's entire focus was shifting. And because John still held roughly a fourth of Standard Oil, when it was divided into 34 distinct companies, he received stock in all of them, and after they were divided, he received stock in all of them. When his shares went public, investors nearly tripled their value. As a result, John grew even wealthier. John was on his way to becoming the world's first billionaire by the end of 1911, the same year Standard Oil was dissolved. In the race for the title of world's richest man, Andrew Carnegie had fallen far behind. But now that John had amassed unfathomable money, only one question remained: what is he going to do with all of that money? John was the world's wealthiest man, and now that he was retired and his old company had been liquidated, he resolved to devote the remainder of his life to philanthropy. And, although he was almost 70 years old at the time, John's sense of duty meant that he was just as enthusiastic about charity work as he was about business. Throughout his life, John claimed to be a soldier of God, sent to Earth, and given money for the welfare of mankind. And John was determined to make a difference in the world. To be fair, John had been donating to numerous groups since his first payday. At least 10% of his earnings. Even when his large donations were publicly described as measures to improve his image, John remained unconcerned. Also, a lot of money was given away anonymously. However, John desired to make his generosity a well-oiled machine that would carry on his legacy. So, in 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation with the two people who had previously been in charge. Frederick Gates and his son, John Jr., managed their own finances. By this point, John had given away about $150 million, and he planned to give even more in the future. $540 million is the entire amount. In addition, Frederick and Jr. gave out an additional $537 million through their foundation. Jr. personally donated an additional $540 million of his father's wealth to the organization. The Rockefeller Foundation has provided numerous billions of dollars in its over 100-year history and continues to do so now. Calculating the exact sum and correcting for inflation is complex, but it's safe to conclude that it's in the tens of billions, placing John among the wealthiest people in the world and history's most generous donors. At its inception, the Rockefeller Foundation concentrated on two major issues: medicine and education. Education has clearly made a significant contribution to society. On the medical front, John's contributions to laboratories and medical research institutions helped to spark an age of scientific discovery that saved hundreds of thousands of lives from diseases such as hookworm, malaria, and meningitis. On the education front, John's money saved the southern United States from abysmal poverty and helped build hundreds of schools all over the world, including two of the world's largest and the most prestigious research institutions. Today, the Rockefeller Foundation provides even more for a variety of other causes, and it is all for the better. It all started with a 16-year-old who needed to establish a business to help feed his family. However, all of this generates an important moral discussion about what we should truly believe. What about Rockefeller? Clearly, John's legacy has two faces. What makes him so problematic is that he is good, writes the author of his biography. His good side was every bit as good as his bad side was bad. It's almost as if there were two different John D. Rockefellers. He has a generous and patriotic side to him. However, there is a corrupt, harsh, and ruthless aspect to the character. Both perspectives are correct, but regardless of your opinion of John D. Rockefeller, he is one of the most fascinating businesspeople in history. Perhaps this is why, after John died at the age of 97, his son with the same name claimed, "There was only ever one John D. Rockefeller." But if you think Rockefeller's story is controversial, wait until you see other uncovered facts in the playlist that pops up now. Just click the thumbnail on the screen, and I'll see you there in a second. Cheers!